we want you to just type in the chat, right? And just type in the chat, give a shout out, and type in the chat, and just ask your questions there. And we will compile the questions, and after the content for 45 minutes, we are going to then address those questions. And after which we will have one final part where we will do some final announcements on some upcoming programs and the feedback, and then we will call it a night. So it's going to be interesting, and once again, I welcome all of you. So before I pass the floor to our speaker for today, Mr. Saurav Rao, please allow me to introduce him. Mr. Saurav Rao is a senior management professional. He has a decade-old career in the telecom sector, and he's been very exposed to cybersecurity and data science and so on. Some of the things that is worth mentioning here is that he's very much into emerging technologies, the Internet of Things, and I think this is he now resides in Belgium with his beautiful family, and also worth mentioning that he's a member of the Wiley Innovation Advisory Council IoT chapter and the Internet of Things Council Europe. So we are getting the best here, and Mr. Saurav also holds an MBA, Masters in Telecom from top global school. Most importantly, Saurav is a dear friend of mine, and I really treasure this friendship, and he's a great communicator, very well versed in this topic, and really want to thank Saurav for taking the time in his busy schedule, in his travels to do this and to share knowledge with us. And so he gives a global perspective, and I'm really looking forward to this talk. And without further ado, I would like to pass the time to Saurav. Over to you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Raj. That's a very kind introduction. So I really appreciate that. Thanks a lot, Raj. I'll just start sharing my screen. Let's see if it works well. Yeah, I think it's visible to you. Can you just confirm if it's okay? If you can see the slides?
Yep, it's good.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. So, well, thanks again, Raj and Joyce, for organizing this really interesting webinar. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining in. I understand it's quite late out there on a Friday evening, and yeah, it's almost a weekend, right? So, thanks again. Well, first thing, I really hope you and your loved ones are keeping well. That you are trying to take as much precaution as possible through this pandemic, as it's kind of getting worse in many parts of the globe, right? And I hope you stay safe and you stay well. And so what we'll try to cover during the next 45 minutes or so is we'll try to look at how this pandemic is actually in one way giving a momentum, kind of fillip to the introduction and adoption of emerging technologies. Now, not all of these technologies, you can say, have been created just during the pandemic. Now, what we'll definitely see is their adoption, their implementation, and their market acceptance has increased during the pandemic. We'll also try to understand what are some of the consumer trends that have happened, that have kind of played a cause and effect with respect to the technologies. So we'll try to understand what are those trends in terms of consumer behaviors that we monitor. Third, we'll also try to understand which are those technologies that have played a key role in the recent past. Now, of course, for paucity of time, we might not be able to go through all those technologies, so we'll try to understand the most important ones. And finally, we'll also try to understand what companies can do to leverage emerging technologies and the capabilities around digital, around data that are evolving, and especially thanks to the pandemic, that they're getting more and more emphasis upon. And we'll try to understand how exactly can companies look forward to embedding them in their systems and in their operational paraphernalia. So let's start with some something that is really interesting here. So the COVID actually over the last, I would say, 13, 14 months since we started having COVID, it's actually also served as a digital accelerant. Now, and why do we say so? It's primarily because when you look at how the role of technology has evolved, so today technology is being used by governments. We all see that across the globe today. More and more governments are using technology to reach out to people, to take care of their medical infrastructure, to take care of the interactions they're having with their populations, to make sure the healthcare is available to one and all. We see businesses. So, for example, a very good example is today, if we are talking to each other, you're in Malaysia or some other parts of the globe, I'm in Belgium at the moment, we are still having this session. That's what business continuity is all about. So we are able to interact, we are able to transact our businesses irrespective of where we are. We also see healthcare professionals, so that's where the healthcare and medical research and all come in, where we clearly see that a lot of it is now also happening virtually. Now, pre-COVID, we did have them virtually, but now because of COVID, because you're not able to interact personally or face-to-face with your let's say general practitioner or with your medical team, so you actually have to interact with them virtually without having that personal interaction that you would normally have otherwise. We see so many researchers, we see so many medical scientists across the world with major pharma companies, big or small, that are actually trying to help find solutions to encounter COVID. You already see a lot of success in some of them. Some of the drugs that are available now to counter COVID have been a direct output of all that research that's happening. And societies, exactly how societies are interacting amongst each other, how things are working between the different population groups in countries and societies. So everything has an underlying theme here, that's technology. So technology is really serving as the key pillar in bringing all these, let's say, capabilities and requirements together. Now, when we look at the technology adoption process, we clearly understand, for example, if you're looking at any technology, let's say blockchain, for example, we always start with awareness. Yeah, we always want to understand, okay, what is blockchain all about? How does it help? What are its key assets? What are its key requirements, its pros, cons, etc.? We then try to understand, okay, how can it be helpful to us? Yeah, so there we always try to understand the capabilities that a particular technology can give us. For example, here, if you're talking about blockchain, so what are the key capabilities blockchain can offer to us, and what are the requirements we have? And then we try to map the two together, right? Then you have the acceptability. So once this mapping is done, you try to get the feeling, okay, maybe it's going to work for us. So what do we do? Let's try to learn more about it. Let's try to do a proof of concept, for example. Let's try to see through some trials internally, can we do anything out of blockchain? So there you'll have some trial use cases doing that. And once those trials are complete, once you have your business metrics saying, yes, it's favorable for you to deploy blockchain or any other technology for that matter, then you actually start implementing it in your production environment, right? Now, why are we discussing this? We are discussing this primarily because this entire adoption process usually takes time, right? And with COVID, some of this is highly fast-tracked. Yeah, so normally for any emerging technology, it would be a couple of months before you would actually start from awareness to usage. And now it's not so many months anymore. It's actually the life cycle of the adoption process has considerably reduced thanks to COVID. And how does that help? Now, it's a very famous and a very relevant and important theory that came from Geoffrey Moore on crossing the chasm. So what used to happen with any kind of technology adoption was you would have the early market scenario where the tech enthusiasts, right, who would like to experiment in the labs or come up with inventions or solutions, would be the ones who would be the primary adopters of technology to start with. And they would be kind of the visionaries, you can call them. But those technologies, those inventions, or I would say innovation to some extent, would more or less not find the jump to go to the mass market adoption, right? So many of them would fail. There would be inventions, they would be great in themselves, but would they have mass market adoption? That was always a sticky question. Sometimes investors won't be there, sometimes the market won't be ready for such inventions. Now, thanks to COVID, this chasm, so this gap between getting from early market to the mainstream market gets narrowed. So now you see more and more technologies, especially emerging technologies, if you can call them, uh, they are able to go from the innovation stage, the experimentation stage, to mass market, and that's exactly what's happening with COVID these days. So COVID has really played the role of that accelerant in the recent past. Now, what COVID does is it's actually existing those trends. Now, any of these inventions, any of these technologies that we're going to discuss in the coming slides, are those technologies all new? So if you're talking of blockchain, if you're talking of AI, if you're talking of IoT, Internet of Things, are they new? No, they have been existing even before COVID. What's new is due to COVID, their adoption into the mass market has become more and more prolific. So they have the acceptance is definitely there. We'll see in some examples in the later slides how governments, how companies, how governmental organizations, how societies are using these emerging technologies to take care of the challenges that COVID puts to you. So those are some of the aspects that we'll be looking at in the coming slides. Innovation. Now, what we saw, the chasm, we saw that technology is now being able to move from the laboratories or test beds onto mass market. So what it did was indeed it reduced the chasm, and that moved a shift to disruptive innovation. Yeah? So where we are really innovating now. So that innovative mindset it may have already been there. It's just that the environment becomes more conducive to invent, to innovate more and more, right? And that's exactly what COVID is doing. So it's kind of pushing the boundaries of innovation, and it's kind of trying to give you a sense of the impact that technology can have on our lives, on business, on governments, on societies. Some of the inhibitors that we had when we were looking at the whole technology adoption were getting executive approval. Sometimes we might have a very good idea, but they would not have executive sponsorship. So they would not sit quite well with the decision makers who would, in all sense, be allocating budget to you or be approving your efforts. So that has been removed to some extent. Now the executive bodies that are responsible for the approval of the projects related to technology and their innovation and all, that process has smoothened a lot from the recent past. Clear strategy. Now we exactly know which technologies should be adopted for our companies going forward. Cloud, for example, that we'll cover a bit more in detail in the near future in some of the slides there. Cloud became a kind of hit overnight, primarily because companies realized that they have to continue business as usual, and to maintain business continuity, cloud is a valuable asset. So that clear strategy came into the picture that we really need cloud, as an example. Replacing legacy hardware and software. Absolutely. Pre-COVID, we may not have had that convincing attitude to replace some of the legacy systems that we may have had in our organizations. But thanks to COVID, thanks to the whole flexibility around having an infrastructure that can take care of evolving needs, especially remotely conducting our business, so that reluctance is to some extent going away. budget, as we discussed earlier, that approval to get the budget or to get the consent to move ahead with innovation efforts or to go ahead with some of the technology implementation tasks is definitely getting reduced. So that budget allocation is getting more and more prominence now, and lack of time and skills. A lot of time, companies say, we don't have time to do any of this, or we don't have the skills in house to do any of this. Companies are devoting time now. Companies are upskilling their workforce as we go ahead. And this is also something that we'll discuss towards the end of the presentation today to see which are the key skills that companies are looking for in the near future. So what do companies say? Thanks to COVID, what do companies say in terms of the adoption of digital technologies? How rapid is it, or how prominent it is? Now, this was a survey done on almost 1,200 companies by Twilio. And they came up with a very interesting statistics where they said around 68% of the companies that were surveyed, they said digital transformation efforts have been sped up by a great deal over the last couple of months. So that's like almost 70%, more than 2/3 that actually said that yes, they would like to continue doing digital transformation and that it's being very helpful. Around 1/3, 29%, said it has increased somewhat. The efforts are there. We are still some time to go, but then the efforts are definitely there. And only a very small minority, 3%, said that digital transformation hasn't helped so far. So you clearly see the odds are very much favoring companies that are really looking at digital transformation as we go ahead. Now, having said that, having now understood why and how the pandemic is kind of promoting innovation and invention across companies and industries, and how the chasm has been reduced from early adoption to mass market adoption, let's look at some of the consumer trends that we see that has happened during the recent couple of months. Online shopping. Now, many of us, of course, some parts of the globe are more have more affinity to online shopping than the rest. But then, in the last couple of months, we clearly see a trend towards increased online purchases, towards increased shopping. Now, this was a survey that was done some time back. In some key countries like Brazil, China, Germany, South Korea, Switzerland, Turkey, and what they find is, across many of these categories, you clearly see the increase that we see in terms of online shopping. So, for example, cosmetics and personal care. That's how the maximum increase. Of course, we can't extrapolate this to the entire globe, but it's primarily linked to the countries that are mentioned here. But you clearly see the trends across the globe in terms of the increase in online shopping, primarily because you don't have access to the brick and mortar shops, or to your shopping malls, or to any of those establishments that you might see around in the city. You don't have access to that because they are closed because of restrictions. So what do? You fall back on online shopping. So that's exactly what happened during COVID. Digital and contact payments, very important, primarily because at a time when governments across the globe, when healthcare professionals across the globe are promoting, contact, less contact as much as possible, digital and contactless payments really came into the fore. So because we are kind of, on one hand, if we are shopping online, for example, we are actually doing a digital payment there, but contactless payments, especially if you still have to make a payment somewhere, you clearly see that more and more companies, more and more individuals are using contactless payment systems, right? And you clearly see, for example, in the US alone, the transaction value of these contactless payments is expected to grow from $178 billion in 2020 to $1.5 trillion in 2024. That's a sizable increase that we see happening. Remote working. Today, if we are working, if we are any part of the world, but we are still working, it's something that we like to call work from anywhere, or it's primarily because we don't have a choice, right? We are sitting in different parts of the world. We have our infrastructure with us. We have our laptops, our tablets, or our phones with us that have been provided by universities or our respective companies or governments, and we have to work. So you clearly see remote working happening a lot now. Of course, now with restrictions being lifted in some parts of the globe, you clearly see some the workforce gradually returning to the offices, but not at the extent to which they were there before COVID. Now, some of the benefits that were reported, and this again from the US, as the State of Remote Report 2020, that was commissioned in December last year. You clearly see a lot of them said they would still have to continue with remote working, primarily because they see the ability to work flexibly across the time zones. Around 32% said they would have like to continue with the ability to have a flexible schedule, flexibility to work from anywhere, not having to commute. So these were three primary reasons why many would like to promote remote working going forward. Biggest struggle, of course, loneliness. We all understand that personal touch is missing at the moment. We would normally otherwise be interacting with each other face to face, but now that is missing. But when you look at, for example, Germany, just as an example, right? And if you look at the survey that was done to understand, okay, what do companies feel about remote working and how much of their workforce will be going forward with it, you see almost 43% of the companies expect their people to work from home in the next 5 to 10 years. So that's a big number. Almost 43% of companies say they would be looking at working from home, and work from home becoming more and more prominent in the next 5 to 10 years. So that's a direct, let's say, output of the pandemic and the new ways of working that we see around today. Distance education. I'm sure many of the students here would understand and appreciate. If you're working from home today, that's primarily because of the limitations that have been imposed due to the pandemic, and for good reasons. And you clearly see, for example, the US higher education, you clearly see, for example, this orange, this light orange yellow line, the increase that you see around March, since the restrictions were imposed in the US last year. You clearly see the increase in the online classes. So it almost increased to 100% last year. And this is from the school, from universities and colleges as well. You see a similar trend happening. Telehealth, of course, a lot of us might still be sick. A lot of us might still be affected by COVID, unfortunately. Rather than visiting our doctors, and of course, if you don't have to be in the hospital, if you can still consult your doctors from home, that's exactly what we are doing. And you clearly see the increase in the patient healthcare professional interaction happening more and more virtually rather than being at the doctor's clinic. Of course, you can still go to the doctor's clinic only if it's allowed on one hand, and also if you really need to meet the doctor personally because you're quite critical. But you see more and more trends of patients actually sitting at home but interacting with healthcare professionals. So digital healthcare is definitely a trend that is going to continue in the future as well. Finally, online entertainment. Now, we all are glued to Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever you want to watch, whatever interests you, or online games or whatever. That has increased. Yeah. So before, if I was not very keen on watching Netflix, primarily because I could go out, I could meet people, and now because of the restrictions imposed on us that we have to stay indoors, we see a gradual trend of people getting more and more into online entertainment. So according to a study commissioned by JFK, especially in the GCC region, so that's in the Middle East, almost 62% of the respondents were actually listening to streaming music. 40% were playing video games. Now these are quite in a significant increase over pre-COVID times, and that's something that we'll still see continue happening let's say post COVID scenario as well. Now that we have discussed the consumer trends, we have discussed how the COVID actually accelerated digital transformation. Let's look at some of the technologies that actually played a key role in the entire process. So again, here we are not looking at all the technologies for want of time. But we'll try to look at some of the key technologies that played a role in here. Let's start with cloud. So today, if we are discussing on Zoom, or many of you might be using Teams or any other such online platform for communication and collaboration, they are being powered by cloud. Primarily, and that's exactly because the cloud has the agility to scale up your infrastructure. So with online collaboration tools that are there, they are mostly working on cloud platforms, and cloud has become a key component of the response to engaging during COVID times, for your infrastructure, for your communication needs, for your collaboration needs, healthcare. We'll see some of the use cases of cloud in a bit. So cloud has really been at the forefront of the response to COVID. When you look at some companies, the survey that was done with some companies, and how do they expect the impact of cloud going forward, many of them said yes, cloud is going to work. And if you look at some of the responses in there, so they would like to implement permanent work from home strategies around cloud. So almost 45% said that. Around 57% said yes, they would like to continue cloud, primarily because they would like to set up remote access for all employees. Almost 51% said, yeah, they would like to move more and more applications to the cloud. So primarily, it's actually going to be work from anywhere. You can conduct your business from anywhere, and that's exactly what the cloud will be able to do for you. And that's exactly what you see happening around the world. The adoption of cloud has really skyrocketed in the last few months. You see more and more acceleration to the cloud. So, for example, the graph below here, around a little over 40%. The respondents, so the question was asked, what are the most important changes you're pursuing to prepare for a second wave? Almost 40% said they're actually moving to the cloud. So that's a significant amount, response that we see. Some of the use cases of cloud, not exhaustive. Again, remote education, that's something that we just discussed here with all the collaboration tools that we have, like Zoom, Teams, etc. That's exactly what's happening. Remote medical consultation, something that we discussed earlier on telehealth, that's also happening. 3D printing, this is very important. 3D printing of protective gear. So there are a lot of small companies that don't have access to 3D printers, primarily because they could be quite expensive. So now you have a large number of companies that are actually offering cloud services for 3D printing. So what these companies would do is they would give you the ability they will give you the platform to upload your 3D printing designs and algorithms, and this cloud company that's promoting 3D printing would actually do the printing for you and then send it across. So we see a lot of these companies that want to promote, or that are actually looking to sell protective gear, and that's proprietary for them and protected by IP. They actually are getting in touch or in collaboration with these 3D printing cloud service providers to promote and to sell and develop protective gear, and that has been quite useful in the fight against COVID, primarily because of the huge increase in need that we saw almost overnight for PPE kits or for any other such healthcare equipment that is useful. How did when you look at the figures of cloud, and you clearly see the increase in Zoom, for example, of collaboration platforms. So Zoom really stood out in terms of collaboration platforms out there. And so this was figures from last year. Now, once the COVID started coming in around, let's say, or beginning last year, you clearly see the skyrocketing trend of Zoom adoption. Now, of course, there was some discussions always about security, privacy across all these collaboration and conferencing platforms, but we still continue. So today, if you're having this discussion, for example, that's primarily because of the benefits that cloud is providing to these platforms, right? So cloud has really promoted a lot of this effort going forward. AI adoption skyrocketed during COVID. So when you look at artificial intelligence, the capabilities that AI has in terms of not only data analysis, but also in terms of looking at, okay, what next, or looking at those trends that the usual analytics methods cannot provide for you. AI has been a key support for the response against COVID. Many of the drug trials that have happened have been let's say fast-tracked because of the capabilities of AI. So it was able to sift through a lot of information, a lot of data from very different sources, and that's exactly what you see there. Life sciences, for example, on the right, you see around 77% increase in AI adoption. You clearly see industrial manufacturing 93%, financial services 84%. So you see AI has been adopted by across by all industries practically, some more, some less, but you clearly see the impact that AI has and will continue to have in the future. And we all know AI is one of the most important capabilities that companies are looking to harness today. Right. Some examples of AI, some practical ones that we saw happening during COVID times. So Boston Children's Hospital, they actually came up with a hot zone prediction algorithm using AI, which would actually look through information on Google search, social media, blogs, discussion forums to figure out, okay, how many people are actually having COVID and not. So they would actually look at social listening, on social media and try to understand, okay, what is the trend or what is the evolution of COVID across the different communities, across the different counties in the US. And this model has actually been adopted by a lot of governments, by a lot of healthcare institutions worldwide, because on one hand, of course, you have the testing, but also not everyone is getting tested, or not everyone, because they may be asymptomatic, they may not have tested themselves. But then those discussions have always helped to kind of combine together with the testing to understand, okay, what's exactly happening. And that's where AI came in for hot zone prediction. Test kit development. Now, we may have read stories about how South Korea really aggressively started testing its population once COVID started there. Many of us may not know that they actually used AI to facilitate the rapid development of coronavirus testing kits there. So you had these drive-ins for testing that was happening there, and of course there were some companies like Sagan, for example, they came up with this COVID testing test in under 3 weeks. That's phenomenal. So you do see AI being used more and more in the fight against COVID, and of course it's across industries that we see AI being used now. But primarily during COVID, AI was also being used, to kind of counter the rapid spread of the virus. Internet of Things. Now, I would admit I'm always a little biased towards Internet of Things, primarily because I'm also kind of quite deeply into IoT, but the whole nature and the capability of IoT in interconnecting so many devices and sensors across the spectrum from different sources, from different varieties. So all that information can be used for a lot of purpose, and that's exactly what companies, governments, healthcare professionals have been able to harness in the recent past, in their response to COVID. And exactly that's what you see. Around 47% said that indeed, thanks to, if you compare them to pre-COVID times, around 47% said they definitely have an increased priority to including IoT in their either in their work, in their organizations, in their operations, or in the response against COVID, right? How was IoT used during COVID times? So some examples again: facilities management. So in Vancouver, in many hospitals there, they'd actually installed IoT buttons. So they called it Wanda Quick Touch from the company Vision State, and these buttons or these sensors or devices would actually send alerts to the management on cleaning, on maintenance. So for example, if some place it was cleaned, but then the sensor detects that it's not as clean as it should be, it sends an alert, right? So this not only helped to maintain cleanliness, to maintain hygiene, but also made sure that public risks to safety arising as a result of COVID or as a result of the huge population numbers that you would see in the hospitals, so that those risks can be mitigated to some extent. So that was facilities management, where IoT was used quite successfully. Patient care. Now, China, many of us would know, really used technology from quite early on, and one of their very interesting use cases was, so they actually built a lot of field hospitals across the country, and especially the one in Wuhan. So they actually used 5G connected robots that would deliver food, drinks, medication to patients. So what you did was they actually limited the interaction that the healthcare professionals would have to patients, and it was limited only to providing the basic care, only to providing the medical care that was needed, and for everything else, like deliveries and all, that was actually done to a large extent by robots. So that's how, so these robots were actually able to interact with each other through IoT, and the interaction was quite fast because of 5G high-speed connectivity, and they were able to kind of promote these services out there. Patient screening. Lastly, patient screening and cluster detection. So in Kinsa, that's one of the companies in the US, Kinsa Health. So they actually gathered a lot of information from its connected thermometers. So Kinsa is a manufacturer of connected thermometers, so IoT-enabled thermometers, and they actually used that to produce daily maps that can be that was then used to map the evolution of COVID across the different communities in the US. So they would actually look at clusters where COVID might be more prominent, relay that information to the governments and the healthcare workers, and then necessary corrective steps would be taken. So patient screening and cluster detection was being used quite aggressively by Kinsa in many counties in the US. Blockchain. Now, with blockchain, of course, we all know, there are two primary things, let's say, capabilities that blockchain can give you. One, increased security, because the information that is stored on blockchain is across different nodes. So that's why it's called a distributed ledger. And then you also have blockchain being used to verify the authenticity and genuineness of information or of goods and products that you might be looking at. So in some cases, blockchain has also been used to verify the authenticity of the medicines that are being procured for COVID treatment. So that's where blockchain has been. When we look at some of the use cases of blockchain that have been there, contact tracing. Now, a lot of governments almost everywhere have been looking at contact tracing. So very interestingly, in Honduras, so they actually used a decentralized system, so based on blockchain, to help patients keep social distancing while getting medication. So that they used it to track and manage stay-at-home orders. So what they would do is, when they see a patient who is let's say COVID positive, and that patient would only be allowed to go out if he or she is not a risk to the people around you. So they would only be allowed to go out when there is not enough, there are not enough people, or the interaction would be as low as possible, right? So that identifier was given to every person out there through blockchain. So that was quite interesting use case that happened on blockchain. You also had the WHO working together with big companies like Oracle to develop the MIPASA solution. So that was primarily for data sharing. So it was a platform that was used to collect information from very different sources, very different entities. And what they would do is they would address their inconsistencies. So they would help identify errors or misreporting, and they would integrate them seamlessly into more credible feeds. So World Health Organization, when they're coming up with information every day, that information has to be very accurate, because a lot of the response to COVID is based on such information. So World Health Organization has been actively using and promoting blockchain to facilitate this data sharing. Drones. So with drones, of course, we saw, maybe we have seen the visuals in some countries of how drones were being used by the police to warn people to stay away from each other or to go home and all. So drones have also played a key role in our fight against COVID across the globe. Now, disinfection, they've also been used in countries like Spain or the UAE, for example, where they really looked at disinfecting large areas of land that would otherwise not be possible by humans because of the restrictions that have been imposed on. So drones were actually used to disinfect, for example, hospitals. They were used to disinfect cluster areas where there was a high concentration of COVID positive patients. So drones did find a lot of use in the last couple of months. Then you see, and that's exactly what we discussed earlier on, situational awareness or lockdown enforcement, crowd control. So in many countries like Spain, Kuwait, UAE, Italy, drones were actually used to warn people to stay indoors or to move out from a particular area because there were a lot of people congregating there. So that's exactly what happened. So they would urge residents to actually go home. So crowd control was a key, one of the key use cases of drones during the pandemic. Finally, robotics, automation. We all have seen the work that robots can do. We all have seen the automation that can happen. But during COVID, it was really used in many parts of the globe. Primarily because the interaction between patients had to be, or interaction between healthcare professionals and patients had to be as low as possible. So, for example, the droid team, we call it. So in Kigali, in Rwanda, the patients would actually get into the facility, and their temperatures would be checked by machines, which would be equipped with thermal cameras atop their heads. So they would actually, there won't be any human interface there. So it would be a drone, a droid, for example, a robot that will actually take your measurements, relate to the war room or the situation room where there will be a team of doctors who will be monitoring such parameters and statistics. In Sardinia, in Italy, for example, in the Sassarese hospital, they actually used a robot to disinfect the rooms, because Italy was one of the worst affected earlier on during COVID in last year, right? So they were quite impacted, and to limit the human interaction and to limit infections amongst the healthcare professionals as well, they actually deployed these robots to go across the facilities with ultraviolet C lights that would destroy the genetic material of the viruses and pathogens after a few minutes of exposure. So that was really a very interesting use case that we saw of robots being used in the fight against COVID. Now, having understood how COVID really fast-tracked digital transformation, how COVID really made a kind of a shift in consumer trends and behavior, and some of the key technologies that we saw evolving, or let's say being used during COVID times. Let's see how we can leverage some of these technologies going forward, and what can companies and people like us can do in the future as well. So first 2 or 3 slides for companies specifically. Let's look at automation more closely. So companies should ideally be looking at increasing their capabilities around automation, because it's very important they take care of their logistics, of their supply chain, customer services, planning, production, etc. That's very important. I mean, when you look at the capabilities that or if I can call it, the collective capabilities that we can have from IoT, from AI, from 5G. And if you combine all that information together into robotics, that's a quite an interesting, I would say, trend or capability that you can get from your automation perspective. Yeah, so that's important to kind of look at increasing your boundaries and capabilities around automation. So companies would do well to really move forward with automation as much as possible. Resilient infrastructure. Now, COVID has taught us one thing. We always had risk assessment in our companies. We always would be doing business continuity, but how many of us actually look at business continuity from this perspective where we are in and where we are facing in the last couple of months? Not many, right? I mean, this is a scenario that not many of us might have taken into account in our risk assessment. So it would be good to really focus on resilient infrastructure, something where you can, you kind of transform your compute, storage, and network devices. So you actually create pools of infrastructure that can be used as and when they are needed, and without physical configurations. A lot of it can be software driven, so infrastructure on demand, agility. So it's very important to keep that in mind, resilient infrastructure, because if we are able to have this, the next time, God forbid, the next time if a pandemic strikes, or the next time we are faced with a situation similar to this, where we are working from home and we still need to run our infrastructure, we still need to run our businesses, our operations, your resilient infrastructure can be used to create that agility that you need, or that adaptability to respond to such crisis. And finally, business sustainability. So it's very important that we create those metrics, that we create those relationships that are needed to maintain our business sustainability. So it could be our interaction with our partners, or it could be our interaction with internally as well with the different departments. It could be the innovation that we are doing. So it's very important that we look at business sustainability very closely as we move forward. Finally, from an employee's perspective, of course, irrespective of whether we had emerging technologies or COVID or not, but the way technology is being driven, the way more and more technologies are coming to the fore, the way it is being used more and more, employees and organizations would do well to increase and revamp their data and digital literacy going forward. So when we look at data literacy, we are typically looking at how can companies and employees understand the relevance of data to their work. How can data be utilized? Do they understand well about data collection, data storage, data processing, data cleaning? Do they understand how AI can work? Do they understand about data visualization, for example? So can they really figure out when they're looking at a particular audience, and it could be different audience at different times, what kind of information do they need to relate to that audience for the different analysis that they have done on the data? So these are some of the key skills that are needed on data that I think everyone should follow. Digital literacy is more to do with technology. So we are looking at, and of course, in the next slide we'll come to some of these technologies that I suggest that companies should be following. But digital literacy is also important because you need to understand, for example, how IoT will work. You need to understand what digital can do for us. What is the key difference between, let's say, digitization and digitalization or digital transformation? So we need to understand these, because one thing that COVID has taught us is digital transformation is here to stay. Digital transformation is not something that can be treated as a one-off project. It's something that is going to be more sustainable in nature. So we really have to get that mindset shift from understanding digital transformation as just a project to understanding digital transformation as a sustainable effort, something that is going to continue almost forever as a going concern, right? So that's important, that the employees and companies understand data and digital literacy well. Some of the key digital skills that we are looking at, and that I would definitely suggest that we look at quite closely in the future. Of course, data analytics, visualization, hands down, we all need to understand what they are all about. AI, some of the use cases that we saw in there, some of the capabilities that we saw with AI, of course, it's being used more and more across all sections of our interactions. It could be government, it could be companies, etc. It's very important that AI is one of the skills that we kind of understand very well in terms of their benefits. Internet of Things, we all discussed how the different data, the sensors, the devices, when they combine together on the data that they produce, and how that data can be used for so many purposes across the value chain. It's very important that we understand IoT quite well. Blockchain, again, especially from smart contracting perspective, or from understanding the genuineness of a product or a service, that's important and also to make sure the safety and security of the information that we collect. 5G, primarily because of the speed and the capacity that it provides. Of course, it's becoming more and more mature, or in some countries, it's kind of being introduced as we speak. 5G will also be a kind of one of the enablers of let's say, the future of digitalization. Automation and RPA, that's something we discussed shortly. Cybersecurity, very important. We all need to understand the best practices of securing not only ourselves, the work that we do, securing the data that we gather, but also making sure our companies, our organizations understand security very well. It's one of the most, let's say, discussed topics today, cybersecurity, and of course, the risk of not investing or not in being involved aggressively or deeply in cybersecurity is much more than we had before. And thanks to, there are a lot of let's say, red hat or black hat, especially the black hat or the gray hat hackers, especially the black hat, I would say, who are the more unscrupulous people who would always try to kind of make life difficult for employees and companies going forward. So it's important that we kind of devote a lot of time on cybersecurity. And finally, extended reality. Now, both in terms of the interactions that we are having, for example, in the near future, you might have an interaction on Teams or any of these online collaboration platforms through through virtual reality or augmented reality. So it's important. Plus, a lot of pharma companies, for example, are using extended reality capabilities for drug visualization, for their different clinical trials, etc. So it's important that we all understand how and where AI, extended reality, can help us. So these are some of the skills that I think would do well for us to understand, and for some members of the companies to kind of understand them deeply, more than the rest. But it's important that people understand these capabilities going forward. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention to this presentation. I'm more than happy to speak more on some of the questions that you might have, and discuss it from there. Thanks a lot. Raj, over to you, please. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much, Saurav. And that was, excuse me, very informative. And I really like the fact that you divide it into two parts, which is basically the application of things, the lifestyle integration, and the second part of it, which is the technology part of it, with the emerging technology part of it. And what I like also is that you gave examples that are not just in developed countries, but I think you've also touched on things like in Honduras and in Africa and so on, which I think it's quite amazing to see the emerging technologies in view of this pandemic and how it has actually accelerated the adoption and so on. Because we also start to see this in Malaysia, for example, like telemedicine has been spoken about for 20 over years, but in the last 2 years it's just accelerated and gone into different levels, with many service companies, startups coming up in this area. And even blockchain also, for the longest time people were talking about it, but the adoption today, as what was done in Honduras is very impressive. And
Yeah.
also, drones are being used. So a lot of this to minimize touch points, to minimize mobility and so on. So thank you for that. And there are some thoughts and some questions from Gwendolyn, but I would summarize it. And I will see the pattern of that part of the question. I think what I see, or what's really the underlying theme of those questions are that, do you see a disparity happening with whether it's in terms of technology, in terms of integration or application, because of availability, or just like what we're seeing in the vaccine, right? There's a bit of disparity happening between developing and developed countries. um, I personally think that there is a convergence, but I just want to hear your expert opinion on whether this is something that you see as a disparities, or is it diverging, or is it converging. uh, how do you see this panning out, especially from whether it's an application or a technology point of view?
Yeah, now that's an interesting question, Raj. And of course, I definitely see the convergence of these capabilities coming together. In fact, when you look at innovation, a lot of companies, especially the MNCs, global MNCs, they're actually setting their innovation centers in let's say less developing, or in less developed, or even let's say emerging economies or developing economies, yeah? Like Malaysia, for example, or India, for example. You see a lot of MNCs actually developing, setting up their innovation centers in these countries. Now it all depends on the strategic priorities a company or an organization has. So some part of the capabilities, and it's also related, and especially if you're looking at heavily regulated industries like pharma, for example. Of course, due to IP reasons or other regulatory reasons, not every research or innovation can be outsourced or moved to another country, primarily for regulatory purposes. But then where it can, it is being moved, and earlier the thought was always about cost, but no, it's no longer about cost. It's a lot about skill sets. It's a lot about access to that talent that you can find in those places, right? So it's no longer about pure economics. It's more about talent as well. And of course, indeed, where companies are able to do that, they are doing that. So I would say it's a complete convergence. It doesn't matter where you are in terms of innovation, in which country you are in. For example, the innovation that happened to come up with these drugs for COVID, they may have happened in any part of the globe, but today that innovation is being used across the globe. The medicines that are being manufactured, so the Serum Institute in India, that's one of the biggest manufacturers of medicines right now. So they actually are using that technology to manufacture those medicines. So it's a convergence, yeah. I mean, the world has become more globalized, yeah.
Very good, very good. And I like your perspective that basically it is no longer about economics, but it's about the availability of the talents. And so, having
Absolutely.
said that, are these talents being developed irregardless of geographical positioning and knowledge levels and fundamentals, especially when you talk about education now, being globalized and taking on a different perspective. So, are there a correlation between the investment or the seriousness of the government to intentionally create these kind of talents that are available, to contribute to companies that want to develop such technologies even further?
Yeah. So, and one of the things that we'd see is, let's say, if you look back 1 or 2 decades back, we all had this concept of brain drain, right? A lot of people would
Yeah.
be leaving their countries and moving to, let's say, developed countries, especially US, UK, Australia now. And the primary reason for that was, let's say, opportunities at home weren't there. For whatever reason, opportunities weren't there, or these countries were not emerging economies at that stage. And most of the opportunities for growth, for career development, lied in these countries. Now, over the recent past, especially the last 5-6 years, you clearly see the reverse happening. So the brain gain that's happening in many of these countries, India, Malaysia, Thailand, so all these countries, you clearly see the brain gain that's happening. And that's primarily because, one, the government is really promoting that, and the government, I mean, you clearly see these are kind of emerging economies. Those are the next engines of of global growth. The Southeast Asian region, for example, that's the next region of growth that we see worldwide. And it's not only people from these countries that are coming back, but also a lot of expats who would like to move there for better opportunities, right? So you clearly see that the reverse trend happening now. Of course, they do have their own challenges. We have to make sure the spirit of innovation continues. I mean, in our enthusiasm to make sure our economies are growing, we also need to make sure we take the right steps, we take the right decisions to promote innovation. We have to make investments to make sure our universities, our colleges are able to churn students who can actually be employable on one hand, but also get the relevant training to promote in the industry. So unless that quality is given, it might be a little challenge to promote innovation in some of these countries, but it's working. You clearly see the trend happening in terms of brain gain of the recent past. So it's working, and I'm quite optimistic it will continue like this in the future as well.
So that's very good. Thanks for that, Sora. And just a follow through, since we are in an education group, what can education providers do? You've had global exposure in this, and what can we do to make sure that this brain gain, in terms of technology, in terms of knowledge in the areas that you've mentioned just now, which I think is so crucial in the next 10 years, 15 years, and so on. And if we can do that, I know many companies who want to set up shop in this part of the world, but talent and is something that they're always looking at. So what would be your advice to let's say an education provider listening to this, and what can they do to make sure we have that cutting edge when it comes to talent?
Yeah, I would say three things. First, we need to make our education more practical oriented. Yeah, that's so. Of course, we do have theory that we have to learn, but then in many countries, education has still been a lot more bookish, a lot more theory oriented, with not much exposure to, let's say, experimentation or to the practical aspects of it. So that's definitely one. As much as possible, keep the theory, but then grow your let's say grow the adoption of practice oriented learning as well. So let the students experiment in the labs as much as they can, for example. Yeah, let them play with these. Let them not be in the labs only during those lab periods that we had, only during those dedicated periods. So let them have that natural inquisitiveness to understand things from a practical perspective. That's one. Second, make sure the learning portfolio that you have, or the learning opportunity you have, is constantly being revised every year to make sure they are more in line with the trends, in line with the evolution of these capabilities that we are looking at, for example. So, for example, if today, if a program, if a, let's say, a program doesn't have AI, and I'm looking at relevant programs, like the ones that are related to data sciences or the ones that are more scientific oriented, if they don't have AI, they might be missing out on something. So it's important to revise those learning opportunities to make sure they're more relevant. And third, industry partnerships. That's also very key. Make sure you develop those industrial partnerships so students and the industry can interact with each other. They can be through dedicated sessions, they can be through internships, they can be through dedicated projects sometimes that the industry can give to the students, because then it helps both ways. Yeah? So I think these three can definitely help to make the workforce more pragmatic and to make more relevant in terms of skill set. Yeah.
Okay, that's excellent. And so we're going to take another question. So this is sort of like a different dimension to it, in a sense where, I think it's a little bit in terms of risk and security, because many a times, such of these technologies can be abused as well. And, I was reading recently that even Facebook was struggling with their AI program and their AI initiatives and so on, because AI is really about the artificial intelligence of learning, right? So if you put garbage in, it's going to be garbage out. So it's trying to figure out, and it has actually caused more trouble, more problem for Facebook than actually good. So what are your thoughts on this part of how can abuse be minimized, or from your experience, what are some things to watch out for, if especially maybe countries that are new in this, some things that would be a red flag, and what to look out for in terms of security risks and abuse of this technology?
Yeah, so one of the things that, of course, we are also doing as a company, but I clearly see many government organizations also looking at it, is promote and share best practices. Because a lot of times what happens is companies, they take the veil of IP. Yeah, in terms of best practices, they say, oh, okay, if we have detected something that can harm, let's say, some process because of whatever reason, I'm not going to disclose it in a public forum, primarily because this is a kind of competitive advantage that we can have over others. So others can face a problem, but we won't face it because we have detected it, and we'll make sure it doesn't happen again. That shouldn't happen, right? That's not good for the development of technologies, but also for science, and that's not okay. So I would say open sharing of best practices is something that definitely should happen across all segments of society and organizations and governments. That's one. Second, in terms of knowledge sharing, so this is about best practices, but in terms of knowledge sharing, and you do have a lot of these conferences that happen now on topics. One thing that really is missing in those in those topics is do they how do they affect society? Because at the end of the day, whatever we are doing, we are losing touch with how it can affect society and how it can impact society. So I think companies would do well, or organizations that are working with technology would do well to keep that always in mind. How is it going to benefit society? Because we're always looking at profits to some extent. Many companies look at profits, but does it have a kind of human significance? Does it have kind of societal impact? That's also quite important. Because technology might be great, it might be great, but then if it has a negative impact on society, it's not that great, because in the end it's going to fall back on you. So it's not okay. So I would say it's important that we share best practices, and second, that we understand how they're going to relate to society. Yeah.
All right, brilliant, brilliant. So I'll have one last question in view of time, but I also have like a back end question to that, because there is a question here on, I think we sort of answered this, but we can just clarify this further, that digitalization also brings inequality. But I think from what we have discussed, it actually is quite the opposite. It kind of brings equality because of the ability to cross border. And of course, I would love to hear your thoughts. In terms of, we are not having this first world, second world, developing world kind of mindset. Third world and so on. But it's a digital world right now. And so the rather the back end question to that is you mentioned a lot in terms of the software, or rather the emerging technologies as more software driven. I would think in terms of with the exception of drones and droids and so on, which is great. What about something like what, from your experience or your observation, what are some basic, like bottom of the billion kind of technologies that are really at fundamental level? Meaning, for example, it could be as simple as a simple tablet, that I've seen before in Africa, in India, nothing fancy, but enough for learning, enough for communicating, or enough for telemedicine, enough for education work and so on. So, I think maybe you can address this in one breath, in the sense where,
Yeah.
is there inequality, and are there initiatives around the world to reduce this gap, even from basic computer hardware kind of approach in terms of accessibility? Your thoughts, please.
Yeah. Yeah. So first, just to highlight a bit on the inequality part, or on the issues of inequality. Definitely, I mean, with any technology, there is always a risk of it being misused, or even for AI, for example, there are a lot of studies on how it can create some kind of, let's say, gender bias or any other kind of bias. right? So it all depends on how you're promoting it, how you're using it. So there are a lot of studies ongoing on that, and things, because these are emerging, so nothing is mature. Yeah, so it's emerging, you learn, you make sure it's like addressed, then some other top issue comes up, you again address it. So it's emerging, it will, I mean, that's why none of these technologies is mature in itself, right? So that's one. So all this topic about inequality or security, these are relative, because it's evolving. All these that's why it's called emerging technologies, right? It's evolving. Second, in terms of access to some of these capabilities, like let's say tablets and all, yes, there was a difference. I would say there was, not anymore. There was a difference in terms of accessibility to some of these capabilities. Like people, for example, in the developing world, especially the ones from the economically weaker sections of society, may not have had access to tablets, or let's say the likes of Apple, for example. They may not have had access to the likes of Apple, but there have been a lot of entrepreneurs in many of these countries and even abroad as well, who have made sure they come up with products and solutions that can help the weaker sections also get in the mainstream of accessibility to these capabilities, right? So, for example, you have in many of these developing countries, you have tablets or you have phones for as little as $100, for example, or maybe even less, even $50 perhaps, right? But you are able to access internet. And that's the key part. If you're able to access internet, if you're able to access some of the documents that are given to you on those tablets, you are let's say connected, right? And now, especially with COVID, and where that physical classroom is not happening, a lot of weaker sections of people, their children, they're still learning. Of course, I would say there are challenges. Not everyone still has access, but uh, compared to before, they still are able to, primarily because handsets that are given to them. Okay, their parents might have had a lot of hardships to even buy that handset, for example, even though it might be costing quite less than an iPhone or whatever, just as an example, a fraction of an iPhone, for example, but at least it serves the purpose. Yeah. So I would say, yes, in terms of connectivity as such, it is there. You can get access to connectivity because you have a whole range of devices or connectivity modules out there, irrespective of the price. You can do that. Of course, in terms of how good quality that is, that's another story, right? That's another story. But in terms of accessibility, I would say it's getting better. It's still not yet there. It's getting better. And it's not only about emerging economies. Even in developed economies, there are a lot of families or sections of society that still don't have access to that. So it's everywhere. Yeah, yeah.
Very good. Thank you so much, sir. I agree with you. I mean, sometimes even in parts of the States, United States, in New York as
Yes,
well, you don't have
absolutely.
internet access as well. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, we could go on for hours talking about this. We are
Yeah, it's
both
interesting.
physicists and
Yeah.
still have done this, and I think I really enjoy this personally myself. And I hope our listeners out there have also enjoyed this. And so, on behalf of UCSI Consulting, really want to thank you, Sora, for your time, for your insights, and I thought it was brilliant. I think it gives us it takes us it gives us a real fresh perspective of what the digital world is going to be like post pandemic. So once again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for taking all the questions. We really
Thank
appreciate
you, Raj.
it. Yeah,
Appreciate it. Thanks a
thank
lot.
you,
Thank you
thank
very
you,
much, Raj.
and we hope to have
Thank
you
you.
again. Maybe part
Yeah.
two of this. Once we got everyone's time and
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you so
Sure.
much.
Thank you so much, Raj. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so for the rest of you, I just want just some final announcements before we wrap up. I know time has caught up on us. So first announcement, we have a upcoming event, data analysis and visualization with Tableau. So if you want to know more about this workshop, please scan the QR code. It's really a 2 half-day session on the 7th and 8th of May. It's 9 to 1, 9 to 1. And you're going to get a free book as well. And we have an amazing speaker. So data, just now we talked about skills that you need to have. So this is one of the skills I think you need to understand, big data. And, this helps you to analyze. So please scan if you want to know more about this. It's an upcoming event. And last but not least, we would like to hear your feedback and some of you who are gunning for the ELE points. So you need to fill up the form the attendance, just scan again the QR code again, and you will be able to go to the site for you to finish and complete the form, and also for you to access your ELE points. Yeah. Okay, with that, we just want to wrap it up. And once again, Saurabh, thank you very much, for your time. And for the rest of you, can we have the last slide? If you want to keep in touch with us, please get in touch with us. And, we have our contact details. Last slide, please, Joyce. Yeah. So we have our contact details here. Please feel free to call us or subscribe to our newsletter. Go to our website, follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and also we have a YouTube channel. We will probably there's a lot of contents that are very relevant today, and we will make sure it's all up and running there. So again, once again, thank you all for coming. We wish you a good weekend, a happy Labour Day. And once again, Saurabh, we wish you all the best. And thank you very much for your time, your insights. It's really been beneficial. I personally enjoyed it very much. And I just want to wish everyone here stay safe and be safe. And we hope to see all of you soon. So thank you and good night and good afternoon to you. All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you very much.